I hear a lot of science people talk about postmodernism and what a problem it is in the academic world. A lot of intellectuals are convinced that all reality is subjective and that no one can ever really be certain of anything. But if no one can ever really be certain of anything, how do you educate anyone about anything? I'm an artist, so I've heard this kind of stuff most of my life. Despite what a lot of scientists seem to think, postmodernism isn't some kind of disease that needs to be cured. The problem was caused by intellectual negligence on both sides. You can look up the history of postmodernism on a few 100,000 websites and see who came up with its ideas when. But the history of a vague idea doesn't tell us much. It's much more useful to talk about why the ideas of postmodernism keep attracting support now. Science people aren't the only ones trying to tell a new story of the world. A lot of humanities people are too. They're both trying to create a new foundation for our American narrative. But the American narrative has always been founded on Christianity, so people who are trying to change that only have one example of a national narrative to compare their efforts to. We've had the internet for 20 years now, and we're used to the new story coming together from all the ideas around us. But postmodernism and the problems that led to it have a multi-generation head start. It's easy for the people who grew up with the internet to believe in the new story that it makes possible. But those people aren't college professors or heads of academic departments yet. Everyone who grew up before the internet grew up with the information processing power we had then. Now a lot of leaders in education still believe in their pre-internet ideas. And a lot of other people look up to them and believe what they say because they're leaders in their fields. Let's back up to the 1950s and think about what life was like back then. At the time, there was no good way for science and humanities to lead to a story of the world the public could accept. They each had different problems. Back then, scientists hadn't figured out how life could have evolved from non-living chemical reactions. A lot of science people felt like they had a new story and they were curious to learn more. But for people for whom curiosity wasn't one of their main motivations in life, it wasn't enough. The old narrative is an interpretation of religious myths. Over the course of thousands of years, people built up a lot of traditions around the story, not just in the content of the story, but about who told the story and why and how. We have churches in every town and city in the U.S., and they have full-time professional religious leaders whose job titles are capitalized, like Reverend and Father and Bishop and Cardinal. All of that implies that they aren't just telling a story, they're telling an important story. People in any occupation who do what they do full-time and professionally and who capitalize their job titles generally know a lot more about what they do than most people. Religious leaders tend to be very good at finding chapters and verses in the Bible to support ideas. Now it's the 1950s and science people are talking about their new story. They're professionals with capitalized titles like professor and doctor who quote reference sources to support their ideas. That makes them look like religious leaders to a lot of people. That also means that a lot of scientists could tell the new narrative the way they were accustomed to narratives being told, and the way a lot of other people expected a narrative to be told, without any of them completely understanding the difference between them. Meanwhile, humanities people are doing the same thing. People have written lots of books about ideas. Why should we assume the Bible is the most important book ever? If you read lots of books and don't assume any of them is supposed to be the most important one ever, you'll learn a lot more. Even if you just focus on reading books from different religions, if you don't assume any one of them is supposed to be the most important, you can learn a lot by comparing religions to each other. Either of those would lead to a better understanding of the world. Humanities people think about these kinds of things a lot, and they have their own reference sources to support their ideas. The problem with the humanities narrative is that it's in the same situation biology was before the discovery of evolution. It's a large body of ideas, but it doesn't have any central concept that connects them. Without that, there's no way to see how one idea leads to another. That's a good enough narrative for a lot of humanities people, but for most other people, it isn't. This means that the science people and the humanities people are using two different sets of talents and skills and two different bodies of work to tell their new stories. Their leaders are full-time professionals with capitalized job titles who can quote reference sources most people have never heard of. They have to do that to make themselves look like the kinds of leaders other people expect to tell a narrative. But that also means that science people and humanities people look like religious leaders to each other. And each of them is trying to break away from religious-based stories, so now each of them sees the other as part of the problem. On top of that, everyone who grew up in the U.S. grew up surrounded by the Christian narrative, so a lot of people didn't know any other way to be the leader of a narrative anyway. So each group was right in thinking the other group was treating their new narrative like a religion. Neither the science people nor the humanities people were using a complete body of work to tell their new story. So they each tried to extrapolate from the ideas they had to fill in the gaps. Science depends on controlled experimentation to discover reliable information, and reliable information is better than unreliable information. But fundamentalist Christian leaders believe they're following the one true path. If you believe you've found a different one true path, it's easy to substitute the new one for the old one and act just like the people who believe in the old ideas. That includes looking down on people who don't follow it. Things like that led to a lot of scientists believing that the only reliable information in the world was information that was discovered through controlled experimentation, and that any other information was either wrong or less important. That included information that other people had based their careers on, like the humanities people had done. This version of the science narrative had no room in it for any information that wasn't science, so science people tried to make it a complete narrative by ignoring a lot of things people thought about. When I talk about science around artists, I hear about this all the time. Humanities people assumed that humanities was more important than anything else. They assumed that since humanities didn't have a unifying theory, nothing else important could have a unifying theory either. So they tried to make themselves look more important compared to religion in telling a story of the world by making science seem less important. And that's what postmodernism is. In the 1950s, World War II was recent history. People's attempts to use technology to solve social problems had led from the concentration camps to the nuclear arms race. In the Soviet Union and China, Stalin and Mao had replaced religious narratives with science narratives and tried to use the information they had to fill in the information they didn't have. All they invented that way were new dogmas for their societies, and they were met with a lot of resistance. Each of those guys ended up being responsible for tens of millions of more deaths. Now let's jump to the 1960s. A lot of Americans wanted a new narrative that wasn't a religious narrative and wasn't like what they had in the Soviet Union or China. That left the humanities narrative. The practical application of the humanities narrative is what we call New Ageism today, with its various offshoots. Postmodernism has become an attempt at an academic foundation for New Ageism, even though some people don't see a direct connection between the two. But when someone tells you about how their New Age feelings led them to a better understanding of the world, if you disagree with the person's discoveries, you're probably going to hear a lot of postmodernist explanations for why you're wrong. Now let's take a moment to look at where scientists went wrong. Postmodernism and New Ageism both started with a distrust of science. Science is the systematic approach to discovering reliable information if experimentation can generate useful data. But a lot of people, including a lot of scientists, forget that last part. Think about how you change the meaning of science if you take away those last 6 words. Reliable information is the best kind. For information to be reliable, it has to be discovered systematically. If you leave out the part about if experimentation can generate useful data, and define science as the systematic approach to the discovery of reliable information, your definition implies that there are no conditions under which anything other than science can produce information that's more useful. I meet lots of New Age people who are supportive of science. They're trying to help expand the definition of science to make it mean what it was supposed to mean from the beginning. Science is the systematic approach to the discovery of reliable information if experimentation can produce useful data. Otherwise, experimentation depends on intuition and trial and error, from which reliable information can potentially be gained. From what I've seen, a big reason a lot of intelligent people distrust science is because what they know about psychology came from psychiatry. To them, the purpose of psychology seems to be to diagnose every uncommon mental characteristic as a sickness. People who have a lot of uncommon mental characteristics, like artists, for example, have heard a lot about that all their lives. The moment you start talking about psychology, they think you're trying to prove that there's something wrong with someone. That leads some to get into a contest to see who can diagnose the other person with more mental illnesses than they have. It leads a lot of others to believe that psychology isn't really a science, and whatever it is about science that makes people think psychology is a science doesn't work, so they should ignore science and discourage other people from believing in it. They've never heard of psychologists studying why normal people lead normal lives and why people who are different from that do different things when they try to lead normal lives. When scientists just assumed their discoveries would reach the public, this was what happened. I've even heard a lot of anti-science beliefs from people who have degrees in science. Before evolutionary psychology was founded in the 1990s, psychology was a bunch of observations that didn't have any coherent theory to connect them. That means that everyone who got a degree in psychology before 1990 did it by doing something other than learning a coherent theory that connects the observations. Whatever those people did to earn their degrees, they worked hard at it. Now a lot of people with degrees in that version of psychology, or who know a lot about it, try to prove that evolutionary psychology doesn't work, just to keep people from thinking their whole education was misguided. Now when you say you know a new approach to psychology that's a lot easier to use, they look down their noses at you like you're a 4-year-old introducing them to your invisible dinosaur friend. Then they say a lot of academic stuff about why psychology is so complicated, and the fact that you don't know what their academic words mean proves that you don't know as much about psychology as you think you do. If you tell them that evolutionary psychology is applicable to everyone all the time, they look at you like you're trying to be the next Chairman Mao. They don't notice how much their own interpretation of psychology has in common with the feudal system, where psychology is the study of how people think and feel, but an understanding of it needs to be reserved for the educational elite that they belong to, and the rest of us are just supposed to be grateful for whatever they give us. Either these people want science to be a new popular narrative, but simultaneously believe that psychology will never be understandable to the ignorant masses, or else they don't want science to be a new narrative. Again, when scientists assumed that their discoveries would reach the public, this was what happened. Now let's look at where postmodernism went wrong with its assumptions that because humanities doesn't have a unifying theory, all reality must be subjective and all knowledge is a social construct. What happens to our education system when intellectuals believe that? If all reality is subjective, then there's nothing we can do to understand the world better because it would change constantly with your moods in between one person and another. That means there's no way for anyone to plan on communicating reliable information to anyone else. If all reality is subjective, that means there are no underlying concepts to anything. That means the best you can do is to memorize what your teachers tell you. In education psychology, that's called rote learning, which is the lowest level of learning. But if memorizing answers is the best anyone can do, that makes a good argument for basing our education system on standardized testing. If all reality is subjective, then there's no way to plan on your teachers communicating reliable information to you. So why bother paying tens of thousands of dollars a year for college tuition? Now that I think of it, part of the reason I dropped out of college was because so many people there treated education like a big game of make-believe. What does that do for marriages and divorces? If all reality is subjective, how do you make long-term plans with someone? Or stick to the plan? Or adapt the plan? If all reality is subjective, then everyone has the right to be undependable whenever they feel like it. What about mental health, and a sense of community, and child development? If all reality is subjective, then no one has any justification for being critical of anyone else's ideas, and the only reason for people to cooperate toward anything is because they feel like it for their own immediate reasons. People with emotional and mental health issues and drug and alcohol addiction swarm all over that because they can expect people to accept them the way they are, and all their health problems are just a part of their personality, and it makes the terms getting help and getting better meaningless. Another group that swarms all over that idea are people who take advantage of other people's mental health issues. They manipulate them, cheat them out of their Social Security benefits, stalk them, abuse them, and rape them. All of those things have happened to friends of mine. If all reality is subjective and everything people believe is a social construct, then child abuse doesn't exist. If our minds are blank slates when we're born and everything we feel is learned, then no matter what you did to your children, they'd never feel like it was wrong because they'd have nothing else to compare it to. Parents believing that leads to emotional neglect and abuse. Parents can be unaffectionate to their children, ignore their children, discourage their children, bully their children just because they think it's funny to watch them cry, blame their children for everything the parents had to sacrifice because they were born, molest their children, or rape their children, and all of them would grow up to be just as emotionally healthy as anyone else. All of those things have happened to friends of mine too, and they didn't grow up to be emotionally healthy. For that matter, if all reality is subjective, how do car accidents happen? Accidents happen because actions you take have unintended consequences for reasons you didn't expect. If all reality is subjective, then all anyone needs to do to drive safely is to feel like the way they're driving is going to get them to where they want to go. If that's true, why do we bother with driver's education classes? And drunk driving would never be a problem because drunk drivers still feel like they can drive safely. There is no amount of academic reference sources science people and humanities people can quote at each other to convince the other side they're right if they don't believe in each other's reference sources. What you need is trust. Nobody believes in ideas they hear about from people they don't trust. If you want people to believe you, you have to earn their trust. For science people and humanities people to work together, you each have to do whatever it takes to earn each other's trust, even if that means doing things you thought weren't supposed to be part of your career. The big problem here is that the science part of the new narrative and the humanities part each depend on a different set of talents and skills, and there are a lot more people who have high levels in one or the other of them than there are people who have high levels in both of them. Just look at the fact that universities have science departments and humanities departments. But how many universities have departments of science and humanities? That should be your first clue to where the problem started. When I talk about the Stanislavski system to science people, a lot of them always assume they can disprove it the way humanities people think they can disprove the Big Bang. First someone says, how could someone actually know that? Just because someone has an idea about something doesn't prove it's true. If I can get them past that mental hurdle, the next argument is, okay, well let's just say I believed that. If knowing that depends on talents and skills that I don't have, how am I supposed to use that information? And how am I supposed to know when someone else is using it correctly? This mismatch in talents and skills necessary to see different parts of the picture leads to the argument from authority versus the argument from ignorance. If you don't want to, or don't know how to, trust the person who can see something you can't. You can make your argument from ignorance, and they can make their argument from authority, and you can both convince yourselves you're right, and you can go on disagreeing with each other forever. That leads right back to the problem I talked about in my last video, where the easiest way to get someone to stop disagreeing with you over something that's so abstract neither of you can see the whole picture is to talk down to them like they're children. A good solution to this problem depends on people on both sides of a disagreement understanding that they need a better solution. In theater, we solve this problem with what we call good faith listening. It means listening to someone talk with the attitude that the things they're saying are going to fit together, even if we can't see how they're fitting together right away. Theater is the most complex art form by far because it brings together all other art forms and depends on the cooperation of people who have many different talents. As a comedian friend of mine put it, oxytocin is way better than adrenaline for getting people to listen to you. If you make them feel threatened, they won't listen to anything you say. But if you make them believe that listening to you is going to benefit them, they'll be receptive to anything. Another way to see a solution is to listen to Native Americans talk about life. When you're outnumbered 65-1 by people whose history is a lot different from yours, and who have a history of getting what they want, regardless of what your group wanted, you can't act submissively to them and hope they'll treat you well. But if you antagonize them too much, they'll find a way to punish you until you either give up or physically can't resist them anymore. What you need in a situation like that is a narrative that's better than theirs at blending your ideas in with theirs. You need ideas that are better thought out than the other people's are, and you need to communicate them more powerfully. You can't win a battle of opinions against odds like that, so you need to get more people on your side and get the people who still oppose you from wanting to oppose you as much. You also need to be self-sufficient so that you can use your narrative to get everything you need in life without the other people's help. You prove your ideas work by using them. If you've never been in this situation before, you can find it pretty easily. Move to a small town. If you have a college degree, you can find a job doing something, even if it isn't in your field and even though it won't pay as much as you're used to making. Then try talking to people there about life without using any references to Christianity and see what happens. How do you use your science-based narrative to earn people's respect if you're the only person in town who believes in evolution? Quoting academic references won't help you. You'll have to find other ways to make your ideas understandable to people. You'll rediscover the art of storytelling that way. You can also prove your ideas work by using them. If you're a smart, friendly person who lives a good life, a lot of your neighbors will notice. For people who believe in most of the science narrative or parts of it, you'll prove it works by living it. People who don't believe in it will still hear some of its ideas from you, which will make them more receptive to those ideas when they hear about them again from someone else. Your family would have to live in that town for generations to earn everyone's respect, but this is how it begins. You probably don't want to spend generations doing this, but in my family we already have. So subscribe to my channel if you haven't already and stay tuned for more videos.